This is TWiT.
So was it overblown? Was the news media overblown? Is it underblown? Where do we lie? Like, I feel like I've heard both.
It is both. So it is the worst security flaw in history only because it affects virtually everything. In fact, Apple was at great pains to say, no, it doesn't affect the Apple Watch, but it does affect your iPhone, your iPad, your Apple TV, your PC, your Mac, even your Chrome OS devices. There's only a few devices, few processors that are so dumb that they don't do this thing that made them vulnerable called speculative execution. The folks at the Raspberry Pi folks said, no, we don't have a problem. It's the slower, simpler processors, but it affects Intel processors, it affects AMD processors, it affects ARM processors made by Qualcomm and Samsung, even Apple. The good news is this might reaffirm why you use iOS, because Apple so tightly controls that ecosystem that they were able to put out patches even before we learned about it. iOS was patched, and then yesterday, Monday, they put out additional patches for Safari. So Apple's been really, I think, the most successful in locking down their systems. So that's really good news. In fact, Microsoft's even had problems. They did get a patch out as fast as Apple did, but then it turned out that people had third-party antiviruses on their systems, something you don't have to worry about on iOS. Some of those third-party antiviruses caused crashes when you installed the update, blue screens of death. And then today we learned that Microsoft's actually stopped its updates because it turns out some AMD-based computers, there's Intel chips, and there's chips made by another company called AMD that are functionally the same, but they're different enough that they were causing Windows machines to crash when the update was applied. So Microsoft's had a hard time. Android is having a very hard time because, as you know, most Android phones are running operating systems that are 2 generations behind and earlier, and they're just not getting patched. Many Android handsets manufacturers and many cell carriers just don't push patches. So really, if you wanted, as an iOS user, some confirmation that you're on the right track, this is it.
So the idea was a lot of people knew about this. They knew about it first in June, and they've been working on patches.
As it should be. So normally in the security community, the norm is that you find a hole. And it was interesting because this was found independently by 2 different groups. And they're 2 different flaws, that they're similar flaws, and you would then notify the relevant companies, whether it's the operating system or the hardware manufacturers, and give them typically 90 days to fix it. After 90 days, the convention is, there's no law, but the convention is give them 90 days. After 90 days, if they don't fix it, well, then it's prudent to let everyone know because hackers by then might have found it. And this is the real concern. And it's I think it's very interesting because there is some sort of synchronicity in this stuff. It's very common that security flaws will be found by independent teams at the same time. Brian Krebs on security wrote about this, and his thesis, I think, is my thesis anyway. I think it's his thesis. He compared, for some reason, he said, well, just like Newton and Leibniz came up with calculus at the same time. So I guess his thesis is it's in the air. I don't think it's that. I think it's security researchers find fertile areas to look at. And this area is you have to be a super genius to discover these flaws. Meltdown. So they take advantage, and Spectre, this is Apple's page on this subject. And Apple does a pretty good job of describing it. Let me see if I can make it very simple. Modern processors speed themselves up, and then Intel started doing this in 1995 by guessing ahead. It's called speculative execution. They guess what's going to happen next. That, combined with the fact that modern processors, to speed themselves up, also keep data in a memory that's on the chip, very fast memory called L1 cache. So these 2 things combine to leak information about what's going on. So the processor's looking ahead, saying, "Well, I think Megan's going to take a left turn here. So just in case, let's get all the data associated with that left turn in the cache." And that usually speeds things up because more often than not, Megan does take a left turn. They're very good at predicting what's going to happen, so they're ready. Oh, we knew you were going to do that, so we have everything, and it's faster. occasionally Megan will take a right turn and they have to go, oh. But here's the problem. Multiple processes are going on in a processor, and other processes can, and this is the flaw, look at what's stored in that fast memory, that L1 cache, and comb through it looking for maybe the left turn Megan was going to take was to log in to her computer. Well, they can say, oh, the login, the password information is now in that L1 cache, and another process unrelated can steal it. So this is a problem if you have malware on your system. That would be the rogue process that's peeking at your memory there and going, ah. Or, and this is a much bigger problem, if you're running on a shared computer system and you say, well, I don't share my computer system, but websites often do. Usually when you get a website, you're not the only person on that server. There are many, many people on that server. Same thing with Amazon Web Services, where they have, lots of people using the same computer. Google has a similar system. So does Microsoft with Azure. That's where it's really problematic, because the bad guy could be one of the people using that processor, and he could just sit there continually looking at what's in the L1 cache saying, is there anything in there? Is there a password in there? Is there anything in there? This is why, though, it's difficult. You don't know what you're getting, and it's kind of random what you're getting. You're just getting a chunk of memory, and you have to kind of figure out, well, is this useful? And I think it's why, as far as we know, and I have to add that little weasel words, as far as we know, there's nobody using this trick yet. It's a hard thing to exploit. And the only reason I say as far as we know is it's also possible. Here's an example of it. You see, on the right, that's the English language version of what's on the left, the memory dump. And you can look through that. In fact, that's what the researchers did, and they said, whoa, there's my password, there's my login, there's the text I'm writing, all of it's there. So that was a dump of the L1 cache. So they're running this Meltdown. Meltdown and Spectre use two different techniques, and they affect computers differently, but the same kind of general idea. And the reason I think this came up is because there was a similar attack called Rowhammer that affected Android devices maybe 6 months, a year ago. And so I think security researchers were looking at these saying, but what we don't know is, did the NSA kind of be looking at this too? And maybe they had, they're smart. Maybe the Russian FSB or whoever, maybe one of the three-letter spy agencies with its very, very smart hackers had also, synchronicity, remember, said, oh, yeah, we should pursue this avenue and see, and maybe they had independently discovered it, and maybe they were using it. It works better, as I said, in a shared environment or in a targeted environment. If I wanted to get Megan, it'd be a lot easier, because what's in that memory dump, I kind of have some ideas about what I'm looking for, right? If it's just kind of, I send it out to 1 million people, I'm going to get so much data back, and I'm not going to know really what I'm looking for. It's going to be a little bit more tricky to sift through all those needles in the haystack. But if I'm targeting somebody, like let's say Sony Pictures Entertainment, let's say I wanted to get into their systems, I'd send them, as we know, this is what happens, a spear phishing attack, an email that says, this is from Amy Pascal, the chief of Sony, and you better open this spreadsheet right now and get to work on it. And you go, oh my gosh, the boss says and you open it up, and if something goes wrong, it doesn't quite work, but meanwhile, you've installed a malware that is now going to sit on your system and run this Spectre or Meltdown attack all the time and look through your memory. And since we know it's on somebody's computer that we know, here's Randall. It looks like Randall Schwartz's computer. See how that secret password. So that's a little bit more of a problem. And so Apple just yesterday fixed Safari as well. So that's the good news. And because we're using iOS devices, there's literally nothing to worry about. You're getting those patches pushed, unless for some reason you're not updating. And really, this is the TLDR. Too long, didn't read, didn't listen. We should do a TLDL. Too long, didn't listen. Update.
And that is what scares me, because especially in light of all the battery stuff that's been going on with updates, I have my focus group, otherwise known as my book group.
They are not updating.
No, they're not, because, well, one one of my book group just switched to a Pixel, which is just such a pain because then I have to restart our iMessage group, and my bubbles are green.
Use
and
GroupMe or something. Use something that's cross-platform.
That's true. But we were all iPhone users.
Yeah.
But then she said, I got a Pixel. I'm sick of it. I updated it, killed my phone. And then, someone else saying, oh, I updated it, killed my phone. I updated it, killed my phone. Don't update. Don't update. Don't update. And I just want to update. Like, I need to know what they mean killing their phone. Like, I think it's probably just any manner of things, but it's this.
It's gotten unusably slow.
Yeah. But I mean, also you're hearing in the background, oh, like when I update, it slows down my phone because I have an older phone.
So then you think you're slowed down even if maybe you're not.
So I think this is part of a bigger problem as well. I mean, basically what you're saying, update and difficult to exploit is different than safe. Like but that's a good point. Probably the members of your book group shouldn't. What they should do is take advantage of the $29 battery fix and get Apple to put new batteries, pretty much no questions asked in their phones, and then update. The advice is update, always update. But I should point out this particular flaw anyway is so hard to execute, and so kind of random in what it gets that it's not hugely concerning to me yet. What it doesn't do, there's another category of security flaws that are much more scary that let people take over your computer, turn on the camera, turn on the microphone, all sorts of things. This does not allow that. This is merely peeking at information. Now, they could use it if what they got was, a password to your bank. I mean, maybe they could use that information. But it's really very much more difficult to execute. I don't think anybody's really done it yet. And what it gets is a different kind of category of information. This is all, I understand this is all really hard to kind of wrap your head around, and everybody's looking for the bottom line. So let me give you the bottom line again. In general, anytime you have updates, many of those updates, some of them are for bug fixes and performance improvements and cosmetic fixes, of course, but in general, almost every update hides at least one or two important security patches, and you really cannot ignore those because it's an announcement, in effect, to bad guys. There's a flaw here, and the bad guys are, believe me, looking very carefully at every security update, saying, and this is why, by the way, Apple is very cagey when they do a security update and you click the link. Well, what is getting fixed? They don't really tell you because they don't want to give bad guys any additional information. But bad guys do work on it, and they go, I see what it's fixing here. Let's see if there's a way to exploit that. And so it's basically announcing there's a problem. It's that end of that 90-day period. There's a problem. And by the way, the people who discovered Meltdown and Spectre have given out code that shows how to exploit it. That's part of the announcement, 90-day later announcement is, here's how you do it, because they have to prove it's doable. So a sufficiently motivated and skilled bad guy could take advantage of it. Whether they will is another matter. It's one of those things where because it affects everything, it's probably worth somebody's time to work on it. Well, I think that one of the most interesting insights on this that I heard was yesterday on TWiT with Amy Webb, who I am a big fan of.
She is so great.
And, I think a lot of us are saying, like, well, I don't really understand this. What's wrong with me? And she basically said, we don't understand this, and that's the problem. As software becomes more and more complicated, the security and privacy impetus is really on the creators of this software and the hardware. And we need to stay vigilant, keep paying attention because it's more intertwined in our lives and it is getting more and more complicated. And even, if you think about like the Melissa virus or something, that was so easy to understand what was going on.
Don't open attachments.
Yeah,
right?
that was all you had to say was don't open an attachment. And we could understand how it traveled around. It could be easily explained. But this is so much more complicated. And I think that's part of why it's so dangerous.
Amy's suggestion, which I thought was really a good idea, was to treat it like a public health crisis. And so for, the flu or Ebola, we have the Centers for Disease Control in Atlanta, the CDC. It's a federally funded agency that does two very important things. It does, of course, the thing that's being done right now, which is put out information to physicians and hospitals and the high-end technical information. But CDC is really good at public relations as well, at getting the word out to normal people what to do about this, what the cause for concerns are, should you be concerned. She says, we have something called U.S. CERT, the Computer Emergency Response Team, is part of the Department of Homeland Security, that is essentially CDC for computer issues, security issues. But what they don't do as well is the PR side of it. And she encouraged them, and I think she's right, to improve CERT's ability to reach out to normal people and give them useful advice about what to do. I said, well, it's really up to us journalists, particularly tech journalists, to not be sensational as many of the mainstream journalists were. I mean, if you watched the Today Show this week, you might have thrown your Macintosh away. I mean, they were really, don't overblow it, but it's up to journalists, particularly tech journalists, to take the time to really learn the story, to really understand it, and then translate it to people. That's what we're doing today. I think this is the job. There's another part that I think Amy came close to, but we really didn't talk about. It is a public health crisis. So you need something like the CDC. You need U.S. CERT to have a good PR thing. But as in any public health crisis, we also need us, individuals, to contribute, to create herd immunities by making sure that the people in your book group update, right? That the word goes forth, not just from techies, but from everybody. As if there were a measles epidemic, parents would get together and would say, okay, well, let's fix this. Let's quarantine kids. And that's what we need to do. So I think there is a problem in that people say, well, it's so technical. I don't understand it. I don't know what to do about it. I'm just going to ignore it, or it's more important to me that my phone not slow down. I'm not going to update. So we need to really put out the word. It is kind of a computer health crisis. And it's only, by the way, I sad to say, only going to get worse. It's not going to get easier.
So get 11.2.2 on iOS. That's the most updated. We had a conversation yesterday about the public beta, because I'm running the public beta on the iPad, and you assume that's also updated.
Yeah. This sometimes happens that there's a disconnect because they're in different channels of development. But generally, everything in the public beta should have everything that all the patches the previous versions had plus, as opposed. But occasionally it will be they get out of sync in your public beta. I've seen this happen actually fairly recently on Windows, where the fix that came out to the public wasn't yet in the new version for the Insiders program. But generally, and I trust Apple to do this right, all it takes is a guy going down the hall saying, hey, make sure that this patch that we just put out is also in your public beta. And I'm sure Apple does that.
And so what about our Apple TV? Was that automatically updated?
There was a TV OS, and it's automatically updated. There was a TV OS. The only Apple device that you don't have to worry about, Apple is at great pains to say, is your Apple Watch. It's too stupid. It doesn't do speculative execution, so it's not vulnerable.
Stupid, dumb Apple Watch. I love
Sometimes a stupid processor is a good idea. There's one other thing we should address, and this was widely reported last week when we first learned about Spectre and Meltdown. The fixes would slow your machine down. And according to the Register, they said it's going to slow your machine down 5 to 30%, hugely. Don't freak out yet. The initial fixes will, but as Apple has mentioned, and this is Apple, if this is from iMore, but Apple said, we tested, for instance, our patch for Safari, and it was like a 1 to 2% slowdown. The initial patches, the quick fixes, are going to be worse, because they're going to turn off speculative execution, or they're going to prevent certain kinds of memory access that will slow down your system, right? You could fix it very quickly, just turn off L1 cache, for instance, or stop doing speculative execution. But that would have such a hit on performance that you'd go, why? It'd be like your iPhone friends. Why is my machine so slow? I'm not going to do that patch. The long-term fixes, and Intel and AMD and the ARM folks, ARM Holdings, are all working on microcode fixes that probably won't have much impact. Apple's tested its fix for Safari, the one that they pushed out yesterday, and says just a small impact. Anything, by the way, you should also probably know this. We've said this for years as people who test computers. Anything less than a 5% slowdown, you won't notice. 5% is kind of the switch for where you would see something, and you'd have to really be paying attention for a 5% difference. 1% difference, you're not gonna notice that. So yeah, that's a case where even if it does slow you down a little bit, the patch is worth doing. It's not going to be a big slowdown, and I'm pretty sure we'll be all right. Now, if you want to know more, if you're like, really, I have to know all the inside details, we will be covering that on Security Now today, right after Mac Break Weekly. Steve has said this is the show. It's going to be Meltdown and Spectre. So you'll get a deep understanding. Steve talked about it last week, but we didn't realize how problematic this was going to be. There'll be an entire show on it on Security Now, the current edition of Security Now for this week.